October. Every garden on my street went dark. Hoses rolled up, cages stacked in garages, beds scraped bare. I went the other direction. 2 old windows from a demolition pile, a few scrap boards, a box of screws. $28, 3 hours. And by November I was picking fresh lettuce from my backyard, while the frost turned everything else brown. I kept picking through December. I kept picking into January. 4 months of salad from a box made of garbage. And when I finally sat down with the grocery receipts, the number on the calculator changed the question I was asking about this garden. I need to back up and explain why I built a cold frame and not a greenhouse. When I first started thinking about extending my growing season, I looked at greenhouses. The small hobby kits run anywhere from $300 to $800. The walk-in polycarbonate models start around $1,000. I stood in a garden center, looking at a 6x8 greenhouse kit, priced at $740 and thought, I do not know if I will use this. $740 on uncertainty, $28 on scrap wood. Not a difficult choice. A cold frame does the same essential job on a smaller scale. It traps solar heat, blocks wind, and holds a pocket of warmer air around the plants inside. It will not grow tomatoes in January. It will grow lettuce, spinach, arugula, radish, and a few herbs, cold hardy crops that need protection from wind and deep frost, not tropical warmth. The difference in cost between a greenhouse and a cold frame is roughly the difference between renovating a kitchen and buying a cutting board. Both involve food preparation. One of them costs $28. Here is where the materials came from. The 2 windows were free.
This one's in rough shape. I'll need to strip all this.
A house 3 streets over was being renovated, and the crew had stacked old wooden frame windows against the dumpster. I walked past on a Tuesday morning, saw them, and asked if I could take 2. The foreman said, "Take as many as you want. We are throwing them out tomorrow." I picked 2 that were roughly the same size, about 30 inches wide, 24 inches tall. Old single-pane glass, wooden frames, a little paint peeling at the edges. They were not beautiful. They did not need to be. The lumber came partly from my own scrap pile, leftover boards from when I built the raised beds the year before, and partly from a neighbor who was cleaning out his shed. He had a stack of 1x8s and 2x4s that had been sitting under a tarp for 2 years. He gave me what I needed in exchange for a bag of tomatoes the following summer. A deal I was happy to make, even though those tomatoes probably had a retail value of about $4. What I actually paid for: 1 box of deck screws, 2 small hinges, and 1 tube of outdoor wood glue. $16 for the screws and hinges at the hardware store, $12 for the glue, $28 total. I have the receipt. It is in the same shoebox as the chicken feed receipts and the fruit tree tags, which is becoming less of a shoebox and more of an archive. Now the build. 3 hours, 6 steps. The build took 3 hours. I am not a carpenter. I want to be clear about that. I taught biology for 30 years. The most complicated thing I ever built in a classroom was a terrarium out of a fish tank and some mesh, and one of my students pointed out that the mesh was upside down. So when I say this build is simple, I mean it is simple enough for a man whose primary construction skill is stacking textbooks. Step 1. I chose the spot. South-facing, against the back wall of my raised bed. The wall blocks north wind. The south angle catches low winter sun, which matters because in November, the sun sits low on the horizon, and every degree of angle counts. I measured the 2 windows side by side on the ground to figure out the footprint, roughly 60 inches wide, 24 deep. 1 spot, 1 angle. Everything else follows from that. Step 2, the back wall. I cut 2 1x8s to 60 inches and stacked them, screwed together at the ends with a 2x4 post at each corner. This gave me a back wall about 15 inches tall. That height matters. The back needs to be taller than the front, so the glass lid sits at an angle, shedding rain and catching more sun. Taller in the back, shorter in the front, like a desk with a tilted top. Step 3. The front wall. Same approach but shorter. One board, about 7 inches tall, screwed into the same corner posts. The angle does not need to be precise. Mine was roughly 30 degrees. In my teaching days, I would have calculated the optimal angle based on latitude. In my gardening days, I eyeballed it and moved on. Step 4. The sidewalls. I cut 2 boards into trapezoids, taller at the back, shorter at the front, angled to match the slope. This is the only cut that requires a diagonal line. I drew it with a pencil and a straight edge, cut it with a handsaw, and it came out slightly crooked. I screwed it in anyway. The lettuce, as it turns out, does not care about straight lines. 4 walls, 1 angle. Now the lid. Step 5. I laid the 2 windows across the top as a lid and attached them to the back wall with the hinges. This lets the lid open like a book. Tilt it up to water or harvest. Prop it open with a stick on warm days for ventilation. Close it at night to trap heat. I ran a bead of wood glue along the seams where the boards met, more for draft-proofing than structural strength. Cold air through cracks is the enemy. Same as a draft under a classroom door. 30 teenagers stopped paying attention. Step 6. I filled the bottom with about 4 inches of good compost, some of it from my own pile, which by then had been working for over a year, and leveled it with the back of a rake. The soil inside a cold frame does double duty. It grows the plants, and it absorbs heat during the day, releasing it slowly at night. Dark, rich compost absorbs more warmth than pale, sandy soil. I learned this not from a book, but from sticking my hand into the compost at 4 in the afternoon and being startled by how warm it was. The whole thing was done by mid-afternoon. I stood back and looked at it. It was not beautiful. The boards did not line up perfectly. One window sat slightly higher than the other because the frames were not exactly the same thickness. My neighbor walked over, looked at it, and said, "Is that made from garbage?" I said yes. He paused. He said, "Huh." That was the full extent of his review. Now, what to plant? I sowed seeds directly into the compost on October 1st. 5 crops, each chosen because they handle cold well and grow fast enough to produce before the shortest days of winter slow everything to a crawl. Lettuce. I used a cold hardy variety, a butterhead type, and a loose leaf mix. Lettuce germinates in cool soil, around 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and the seedlings tolerate light frost. Inside the cold frame, the soil stayed above 50 degrees through most of October, which meant germination in about 7 days. I scattered the seeds thinly across a row and covered them with a 1/4 inch of compost. Spinach. True spinach, not the warm season imitation. It germinates even more reliably in cold soil than lettuce does, and in fact, it prefers it. Anything above 75 degrees and spinach seeds sulk and refuse to sprout, which is why so many summer sowings fail. I planted a row beside the lettuce. Spinach is slower to start, about 12 days to germination, but once it gets going, it keeps producing leaves for weeks. Pick the outer leaves, leave the center. A small green factory that does not know it is supposed to stop. Arugula, the fastest of the 5. Germinated in 5 days, first harvest-ready leaves in about 3 weeks. Arugula has a peppery bite that sharpens in cold weather, which I did not know until I tasted a November leaf and thought someone had slipped mustard into my salad. Radish, a small round variety, the kind that matures in 25 to 30 days. Radishes are the instant gratification crop of the cold frame. When everything else is still a scatter of tiny green threads, the radish is already shouldering its way out of the soil, pink and round and absurdly confident. 4 crops down. One more, and this one surprised me. Matchee, also called corn salad, a mild, nutty-tasting green that thrives in cold and barely exists in American grocery stores. A packet of seeds cost $2.40. I had never grown it before. It became my favorite thing in the cold frame, small rosettes of soft leaves that taste like a polite version of lettuce, with more depth. 5 crops in, $12 in seeds. Now the waiting. Total seed cost, about $12 for all 5 packets, with plenty of seeds left over for a second sowing in November. The seeds are not included in the $28 build cost, because I had most of them already. But even if I had bought them fresh, the total investment would have been $40. October. The first harvest came on October 22nd, 3 weeks after sowing. Arugula, mostly. Small leaves, but enough for 2 salads. By the end of October, the lettuce was up, the spinach was thickening, and the radishes were showing their pink crowns above the compost line. I opened the lid every morning to check, and some mornings I left it propped open for an hour or two, because the interior temperature climbed into the 70s when the sun hit the glass. Ventilation matters. Too much heat and humidity invite mildew. A stick propped under one corner, 6 inches of gap, is enough. November. This is where it got interesting. Outside, the first hard frosts arrived in the second week. I woke up on a Thursday morning, looked out the kitchen window, and the garden was white. Every bed was stiff with frost. The raised beds looked like they had been dusted with powdered sugar. The grass crunched when I walked across the yard. I lifted the cold frame lid, and the lettuce was green and alive. Not wilted, not burned, not damaged. Green. The inside temperature that morning, measured with a cheap kitchen thermometer stuck into the soil, was 41 degrees. The outside air was 26. A 15-degree difference, created by 2 old windows and a box made from scraps. I harvested lettuce and arugula every 4 or 5 days through November. Not large amounts, maybe a colander full each time. Enough for a side salad with dinner, which is more than any of my neighbors were growing. The spinach was slower, but the leaves were thick and dark green, the kind that tastes sweeter in cold weather because the plant converts starches to sugars as a natural antifreeze response. I knew the biology from my teaching years. Tasting it from my own cold frame in November was something else entirely. December. Growth slowed. The days were shorter, the sun set earlier, the angle was lower, and the cold frame received maybe 4 hours of direct light on a clear day. The plants did not die. They paused. The lettuce leaves already formed were harvestable, and new leaves grew at perhaps half the October pace. I picked less frequently, once a week instead of twice, but I was still picking. Fresh greens from my garden in December. The matchie came into its own this month. While the lettuce stalled, the matchie kept forming rosettes slowly and quietly, unbothered by the cold or the short days. I started keeping a small notebook by the back door. Morning temperature outside, morning temperature inside the frame, afternoon temperature inside. The pattern was consistent. On a clear December day with outside air around 30 degrees, the interior of the frame climbed to 50 or 55 by early afternoon. On overcast days, the gain was smaller, maybe 10 degrees instead of 25. The glass and the dark compost together work like a battery that charges in sunlight and discharges slowly overnight. By dawn, the interior had usually dropped to within 8 or 10 degrees of the outside air. Still enough to keep leaves alive, not enough for fast growth. Sunny day, 25-degree gain. Overcast, 10. Either way, the leaves survived. I added a layer of straw around the outside of the cold frame in mid-December, about 4 inches thick, banked against the boards, as extra insulation. I also laid an old wool blanket over the glass on the coldest nights, the ones when the forecast dropped below 20. These 2 additions probably bought me another 5 degrees of interior warmth on the worst nights. The blanket was from a closet. The straw was left over from mulching the garden. Neither cost anything. January. I will be honest, January was marginal. Growth nearly stopped. The existing leaves were still alive, and I harvested them as needed, but new growth was minimal. The cold frame kept the plants from freezing, but it could not manufacture the sunlight that January lacks. I picked the last arugula in the second week. The mosh lasted until the third week. The lettuce held out the longest, small, stubborn leaves that tasted cold and sweet and faintly metallic, like they were extracting the last possible flavor from the winter soil. By early February, I cleared the frame, top-dressed the compost, and started planning a spring sowing. 4 months of harvest from a box I built in one afternoon. Now the math. Here is where the cold frame taught me something I was not expecting. I sat down with the receipts, the $28 for materials, the $12 for seeds, and I calculated how much the same greens would have cost the grocery store over those 4 months. Mixed salad greens at my local market run about $4 for a 5-ounce container. I harvested roughly the equivalent of 2 containers a week for 16 weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. That is approximately $128 in grocery store greens, from a $40 total investment in a structure I can reuse for years. $40 in, $128 back, first season. The return on paper is satisfying. 3 times the investment back in the first season alone, with the cold frame still standing and ready for round 2. The screws have not rusted. The glass has not cracked. The boards have weathered a shade darker, which only makes the thing look more like it belongs. That is the math. Here is what the math misses. But here is what the calculator cannot show. I spent 30 years teaching other people's children about photosynthesis, transpiration, dormancy, cold adaptation. I could have drawn a diagram of a cold frame on a chalkboard and explained the thermodynamics in 10 minutes. I could have listed every crop, every germination temperature, every harvest window without looking at a note. I knew all of it, the way a person knows the route on a map they have studied but never driven. Building the cold frame was driving the route. The moment I stuck my hand into that compost on a November morning and felt warmth when the air outside was 26 degrees, that was not a fact from a textbook. That was a fact from my hand. The difference between knowing that cold-adapted lettuce converts starch to sugar and tasting that sugar on a December evening, that difference is 30 years wide. I used to tell my students that biology is the study of living systems. I said it hundreds of times, standing in front of a classroom with a whiteboard marker in one hand. It took me 57 years to understand what that sentence actually means. It means you build a crooked box from somebody else's old windows, fill it with compost, scatter some seeds, and then you stand outside on a frozen morning and open the lid, and the warmth rises into your face, and the lettuce is green, and the world makes a kind of sense that no diagram ever captured. $28, 4 months, about 8 pounds of greens. One question I did not expect: what else can I build? I extended the season above ground. Next, improving the soil below it. For $0. The neighbors had opinions about the smell.